"Get out. You are not invited," my son-in-law said at the moment I stepped toward the Christmas table he had just finished arranging. He stood there proudly, chest out, staring at me like I was a stranger who had wandered in from the freezing street. What he seemed to forget was simple. This dining room was inside my house. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply set the roasting pan down and looked around the room for a moment. After 4 years of watching my daughter and her husband treat me like their personal bank account, I realized something that night. Christmas dinner was about to change in a way they never expected. I'm truly grateful you're here with me. Before the story continues, tell me in the comments where you're listening, from your city or country. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Also, please note that some elements have been slightly dramatized for storytelling and learning purposes. Any similarity to real names or places is purely coincidental, but the message behind this story truly matters. The heavy silver roasting pan pressed hot against the thick fabric of my oven mitts as I carried it carefully across the kitchen. I had spent the entire morning preparing the prime rib slow, roasting it, basting it, seasoning it with rosemary, garlic, and cracked black pepper, the same way my late wife used to do every Christmas. The scent filled the entire house, rich and comforting, the kind of smell that once meant laughter, warmth, and family gathered together. For a moment, standing there in the quiet kitchen, I allowed myself to believe this Christmas might feel normal again. I pushed open the swinging wooden door that separated the kitchen from the formal dining room and stepped through carrying what should have been the centerpiece of the evening. What I walked into was not warmth. It was hostility. My mahogany dining table, an enormous piece I had purchased 30 years earlier, after receiving my biggest promotion at the engineering firm, was completely surrounded. Every chair was occupied. 12 seats, 12 people. But not one of them had been invited by me. My son-in-law had filled the room with his family. His parents, his 2 brothers, their wives. They were already halfway through dinner preparations without me. Someone had opened the wine cellar earlier because 2 expensive bottles of red wine sat uncorked on the table. The deep burgundy liquid swirled in crystal glasses as they laughed loudly and tore apart the warm bread rolls I had baked earlier that afternoon. The scene felt less like a Christmas gathering and more like strangers celebrating inside a house they had decided belonged to them. I paused at the head of the table. That seat had always been mine. Not out of ego, simply because it was the natural place for the host to sit. But now Declan's father occupied it. He leaned back comfortably, swirling his wine glass with a smug expression that suggested he had already claimed the throne. No one moved. No one stood. No one offered to clear space so I could set down the heavy pan in my hands. For several long seconds, I simply stood there, holding 30 pounds of hot roasted meat, while the room buzzed with conversation that slowly began to fade as people noticed me. Declan noticed first. He was 36 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a carefully fitted wool sweater that I knew was far outside the limits of his unstable income. He pushed his chair back and stood slowly wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, as if I had interrupted something important. Then he stepped directly into my path. He didn't offer to help. He didn't say Merry Christmas. He didn't even glance at the pan I was carrying. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest and stared at me with open contempt. It was the kind of look a man gives someone he considers beneath him. He blocked the space between me and the table, forcing me to stop. Then he said the words that shattered any illusion that this was still my family. "Get out." His voice was calm, but loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. "You are not invited to sit with us," he continued. "This is a private family dinner. We don't have any room for you here." The dining room went silent. The laughter stopped instantly. Forks froze halfway to mouths. I felt a cold weight settle deep inside my stomach. I slowly shifted my gaze away from Declan and looked at my daughter, Serena, 34 years old, the little girl I had once carried on my shoulders through autumn fairs. The daughter whose college tuition I had paid in full. The child I had protected after her mother passed away. I waited. I waited for her to stand up. I waited for her to tell her husband to stop. I waited for her to say something, anything that acknowledged what had just happened. Serena did nothing. She kept her head lowered, staring at the intricate pattern on her porcelain dinner plate, as if it had suddenly become fascinating. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her wine glass and took a slow sip. She refused to look at me. Her silence spoke louder than any words could have. This wasn't hesitation. This wasn't shock. This was agreement. For 4 years, I had allowed Serena and Declan to live in my home, rent-free, so they could save money for their future. I covered the property taxes, I paid the utility bills, I bought the groceries and maintained the house. I carried the financial burden because I believed I was helping them build stability for my grandson Mason, 7 years old, bright, curious, and the only reason I had tolerated Declan for as long as I had. And now, on Christmas Day, I stood in my own dining room being treated like an unwanted guest. Declan stepped closer, closing the distance between us. He leaned forward slightly, using his height in a quiet attempt at intimidation. "I told you to get out, Thaddeus," he said with a sneer. His finger pointed toward the kitchen. "Go eat in there, or go down to the basement. We're trying to enjoy the holiday without your depressing mood ruining it." He expected me to explode. I could see it clearly in his expression. He wanted shouting, anger, a meltdown. If I reacted emotionally, he would use it. He would point at me in front of his parents and claim I was unstable, bitter, losing control in my old age. It would be exactly the narrative he wanted, but 40 years of civil engineering had trained my mind to do something very different in moments of stress. When pressure builds, you stop reacting emotionally. You analyze the system. You identify the weak points. You calculate. So I said nothing. I turned slightly and carefully placed the roasting pan onto the wooden buffet beside the dining table. I adjusted it so it sat perfectly centered on the surface. Then I removed my oven mitts and folded them neatly beside the pan. The room remained silent. Every person at that table watched me as if they were observing an experiment. They were waiting for the old man to break. I didn't. Instead, I turned my back on all of them and walked out of the dining room. My steps were steady, measured, controlled. The hallway stretched long and quiet in front of me. The walls were lined with framed photographs collected over decades. As I walked, I passed one of my wife, holding Serena as a newborn baby, wrapped in a hospital blanket. I passed another showing Serena smiling proudly in her graduation robe. Each photograph represented a memory built on love, sacrifice, and the hope. And with each step, I felt something inside me detach. The unconditional loyalty I had carried for my daughter all these years began to dissolve. She had made her choice. She had chosen her husband. She had chosen silence. I reached the end of the hallway where the large gray utility panel was mounted into the wall. As an engineer, I understood systems better than most people. Every structure relies on critical support. Remove the right piece and the entire system collapses. I opened the metal door of the utility panel. Inside were rows of neatly labeled switches controlling the electrical circuits of the house. Kitchen, living room, upstairs bedrooms, garage. I ignored them all. My eyes focused on the massive switch positioned at the top of the panel. The main breaker, 200 amps of power that fed electricity to every room in the house. I wrapped my hand around the thick plastic lever. For a brief second, I imagined the dining room behind me. The laughter, the arrogance, the certainty that they controlled the situation. Then I pulled the breaker down, hard. The heavy metallic clack echoed loudly in the small hallway. Instantly, the entire house was plunged into absolute impenetrable darkness. The joyful Christmas lights on the tree outside the window died. The warm chandelier above the dining table went black. The humming of the large refrigerator completely ceased. Less than 2 seconds later, the chaos erupted. The terrified screams of Declan's mother echoed from the dining room. I heard the sharp sound of a heavy crystal wine glass shattering against the hardwood floor. Declan started shouting my name in a panicked, angry voice, cursing loudly in the dark, as he presumably bumped into the heavy mahogany table. I did not stay to listen to their pathetic complaints. I opened the hall closet by memory, grabbed my thick wool winter coat, and pulled it over my shoulders. I slipped on my leather driving gloves. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the freezing, snow-covered night. The frigid air hit my face, and it felt remarkably clean. It felt like freedom. I pulled the front door shut behind me, the automatic lock clicking firmly into place. They were trapped inside a freezing dark house with a ruined dinner, and I was finally walking away. I drove carefully through the snow-covered streets of my quiet suburban neighborhood. The bright flashing Christmas lights on the neighboring houses blurred past my windshield. I did not feel sad. I felt a terrifying, unfamiliar sense of total emotional detachment. I drove until I reached the commercial highway on the edge of town and pulled into the glowing neon-lit parking lot of a 24-hour diner. I needed a place to sit. I needed a place to think. I pushed through the glass doors, the little bell above my head ringing sharply. The diner was nearly empty, smelling of stale coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and old frying oil. It was a stark contrast to the luxurious home I had just abandoned, but I welcomed the harsh reality of it. I slid into a cracked red vinyl booth in the far corner, away from the large front windows. A waitress wearing a faded blue uniform and an exhausted expression walked over to my table. She did not wish me a Merry Christmas. She simply flipped a thick white ceramic mug right side up and filled it to the brim with steaming black coffee. I nodded my thanks, wrapping my cold-gloved hands around the hot mug to absorb the heat. I took a slow sip. The coffee was bitter and burned my tongue, bringing my racing thoughts sharply into the present moment. I needed to figure out where I was going to sleep tonight. I needed to book a hotel room. I reached into the inner pocket of my wool coat and pulled out my smartphone. The screen illuminated my face with a cold blue light in the dim diner. I opened my secure banking application to check the balance of my checking account so I could reserve a decent room downtown. The application requested my fingerprint authentication. I pressed my thumb against the screen. The small loading circle spun for a few seconds before displaying my financial dashboard. I scrolled past my basic checking account, which had a normal balance of a few thousand. My eyes drifted down to the section labeled Primary Emergency Savings. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. The breath rushed out of my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. The number glowing on the screen made absolutely no sense. The emergency savings account should have contained exactly $80,000. It was a very specific number. That money was not just a generic rainy day fund. It was the exact amount of the life insurance payout I had received after my beautiful wife passed away from aggressive cancer 5 years ago. I had sworn a silent oath to her memory that I would never touch a single penny of that money for my own needs. That $80,000 was sacrosanct. It was securely locked away, intended to be a complete debt-free college fund for my grandson Mason. It was my wife's final gift to the future of our family. The screen in front of me displayed a current available balance of $0. I blinked rapidly, rubbing my tired eyes, assuming my vision was blurring from the stress of the evening, or the poor lighting in the diner. I pulled the phone closer to my face. The number remained completely unchanged. 0. The money was entirely gone. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. My engineering mind instantly rejected the concept of a computer error. Banks do not simply misplace $80,000. I quickly tapped the screen, forcing my trembling finger to open the detailed transaction history for the savings account. The history loaded immediately. There was only one recent transaction listed. Yesterday morning, at exactly 9:15 in the morning, a massive outgoing wire transfer had been initiated and successfully completed. The entire $80,000 had been moved in a single devastating sweep. I stared at the details of the transfer. The receiving party was not a recognizable bank or a standard investment firm. The money had been wired directly into the account of a commercial title and escrow company located 2 towns over. The heavy, suffocating weight of realization crashed down upon me right there in the lonely diner booth. The disgusting incident at the Christmas dinner table just an hour ago. Declan aggressively blocking my path. Declan yelling at me to get out of the room. Declan trying to humiliate me in front of his entire family while my daughter sat silently by. It was not just an act of spontaneous drunken cruelty. It was a meticulously calculated distraction. Declan had provoked a massive emotional fight, hoping I would be too distressed, too angry, or too heartbroken to look at my financial applications during the long holiday weekend. Declan had not just insulted me, he had actively robbed me. He had stolen the legacy of my dead wife. He had stolen his own son's future. And he was currently using my money to fund some kind of massive real estate transaction behind my back. The Christmas eviction was just smoke and mirrors. The real war was happening in the shadows, and my son-in-law had just fired the opening shot. I sat perfectly still in the vinyl booth, staring at the 0 balance on my screen. The cold detachment I had felt while shutting off the power to the house vanished, replaced by a terrifying burning inferno of absolute rage. Declan thought he was dealing with a weak, tired old man who would simply cry and accept defeat. He had no idea that he had just awakened a monster. The game was no longer about a seat at a dining table. The game was about total, uncompromising destruction, and I was going to ensure that Declan Reed lost absolutely everything. The morning after Christmas was bitterly cold. I had spent the entire night sitting upright in a sterile room at a cheap commercial hotel downtown. I did not sleep for a single second. I spent the dark hours staring blankly at the ugly textured ceiling, while my mind systematically constructed a rigid blueprint for absolute retribution. At precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, I walked out into the freezing air and drove my car toward the historic legal district of the city. The streets were completely empty, covered in a thin, dirty layer of gray slush left over from the holiday snowstorm. The bright artificial holiday cheer that had suffocated me the night before at my own dining table was now entirely gone. I appreciated the bleakness of the morning. It perfectly matched the frozen, desolate landscape of my own heart. I pulled my car to the curb in front of an imposing 3-story brick building. I had helped design the structural retrofitting for this exact building 30 years ago. The polished brass plaque bolted to the heavy oak front door read, "Benjamin Foster and Associates." Ben had been my closest confidant and loyal friend for over 4 decades. We had stood beside each other through marriages, the births of our children, and the devastating funerals of our wives. But more importantly, for my current situation, Ben was recognized as one of the most ruthless, brilliant, and deeply feared real estate attorneys in the entire state. I knocked firmly on the thick glass panel of the front door. A moment later, the heavy deadbolt clicked loudly. Ben stood in the doorway wearing a thick gray wool sweater and holding a steaming ceramic mug of black coffee. He had opened his office on a federal holiday entirely because of the brief, deeply unsettling voicemail I had left him at 3 o'clock in the morning. He did not offer a cheerful holiday greeting. He took one look at my exhausted face, stepped aside silently, and motioned for me to come inside the building. The interior of Ben's office smelled heavily of aged paper-worn leather and strong, bitter coffee. We walked straight into his main conference room, a massive space lined from floor to ceiling with heavy, intimidating law books. I took off my heavy winter coat and sat down in a high-backed leather chair at the end of the long mahogany table. Ben sat directly across from me, placing his coffee mug down with a soft thud. He looked me directly in the eyes and instructed me to start from the very beginning. I did not waste his time with emotional complaints or tearful storytelling. I did not cry about my daughter's pathetic cowardice or the intense humiliation I suffered at the dinner table. I spoke with the precise, mechanical, and uncompromising detachment of a senior civil engineer reporting a catastrophic structural failure. I told him about checking my banking application in the diner. I told him about the $80,000 entirely missing from my emergency savings account. I explained clearly that this was not just spare cash. It was the life insurance payout from my late wife's sacred money, completely earmarked to guarantee a debt-free college education for my young grandson. I detailed the exact time date and routing numbers of the unauthorized wire transfer to the unknown escrow company. Ben listened carefully to every single word without interrupting me once. As I laid out the stark facts, I watched his physical posture completely transform. The relaxed, comfortable demeanor of an old friend completely vanished. His shoulders squared, his eyes hardened into cold steel, and his jaw set firmly. He was rapidly shifting into a state of absolute legal aggression. When I finally finished speaking, Ben remained perfectly silent for a long moment, tapping his index finger rhythmically against the polished wood of the conference table. He leaned forward and stated that major banking institutions do not authorize $80,000 wire transfers based on a simple phone call or a stolen digital password. He explained that there had to be a massive foundational legal mechanism already in place, something that allowed Declan to move that amount of wealth without triggering immediate federal fraud alerts. We needed to find the exact source of that legal authority. Ben stood up abruptly and walked over to his large executive desk situated at the far end of the room. He woke up his sophisticated dual-monitor computer system. I pulled my chair closer, sitting right beside him, as the bright screens illuminated his deeply focused face. The large office was dead silent except for the rapid, aggressive clicking of his keyboard. Ben bypassed the standard public internet gateways and logged directly into the highly secure, restricted digital portal for the county clerk and property records division. He typed in my full legal name, my social security number, and the exact street address of my property. He told me that we were looking for any official document filed under my name within the last 90 days. The database search engine spun for what felt like an agonizing eternity. My heart hammered heavily against my ribs, echoing in my ears. I watched the green progress bar inch slowly across the bottom of the screen. Finally, the system populated a dense list of official registered documents. Ben scanned through them quickly. Most of them were very old and completely harmless. He saw the original deed to my house from 30 years ago. He saw the official mortgage payoff certificate I had proudly filed a decade ago. But at the very top of the list, automatically highlighted in bright yellow by the system, was a completely new entry. The filing date stamped on the document was exactly 14 days ago. It was a Monday. I remembered that specific day perfectly, because Declan had generously offered to take my car to the mechanic to get the oil changed, effectively leaving me stranded and alone at the house for several hours. He had created the perfect window of opportunity. Ben hovered his mouse cursor over the bright blue document link. He paused, glancing at me with a grave, serious expression, warning me to mentally prepare myself for whatever we were about to see. He clicked the link and a scanned legal document immediately populated on the large right monitor. The title printed at the very top of the document in bold, undeniable black letters made my blood run cold. It read, "General Durable Power of Attorney." I felt the air completely leave my lungs. Ben quickly began scrolling through the 4 pages of dense, complicated legal text. He read the most dangerous clauses aloud, translating the heavy legal jargon into a terrifying, easy-to-understand reality. The document explicitly granted my son-in-law absolute, unrestricted, and total control over my entire personal estate. It gave him the unyielding legal authority to access all of my bank accounts, empty my secure safety deposit boxes, make critical medical decisions on my behalf, and effortlessly sell any real estate property I owned. According to this legally binding piece of paper, Declan was legally acting as my absolute proxy. To the banks, the local government, and the entire financial system, Declan and I were exactly the same person. I stared at the glowing screen in pure, unadulterated disbelief. Ben scrolled down to the final page of the document, where the authorizing signatures were located. There, sitting perfectly on the designated dotted line, was my signature. It was an absolutely flawless, terrifying replication of my unique handwriting. Every single loop, every slant, and every specific pressure point was perfectly imitated. Declan had clearly sat in his room and practiced it hundreds of times until he mastered it. But there was one fatal, damning flaw that proved the document was a complete forgery. Directly underneath the fake signature was a small circular date stamp and the official signature of a public notary. Ben leaned much closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing dangerously as he inspected the notary's seal. He recognized the name immediately. The notary was a corrupt individual who operated out of a shady, failing used car dealership on the south side of town. Someone Ben had previously investigated for facilitating fraudulent real estate closings. Declan had not just forged my name on a piece of paper. He had hired a corrupt state official to illegally validate the document, making it appear entirely legitimate and bulletproof to the banking system. This was not a sudden crime of opportunity or a moment of weakness. This was a highly sophisticated, meticulously planned financial assassination. Declan had been laying the groundwork for this massive theft for weeks, smiling at me across the breakfast table while actively plotting to strip away everything I had worked for my entire life. The missing $80,000 was only the beginning of his plan. With this powerful document in his possession, Declan had the absolute authority to sell my house right out from under me without my knowledge. Ben slowly turned his large leather chair to face me, his face completely devoid of any softness or emotion. He looked me in the eyes and stated clearly that we were no longer dealing with an arrogant, entitled son-in-law. We were dealing with a highly dangerous, calculating criminal who currently held the keys to my entire existence. Ben did not stop moving after discovering the forged document. The revelation of the fake power of attorney hung heavily in the air of the quiet office, but there was absolutely no time to sit and process the emotional shock. As a civil engineer, I was trained to analyze the structural integrity of a building after a critical failure. Ben was doing the exact same thing with my life. He immediately opened a new tab on his computer browser. He began to trace the exact routing number of the escrow company that had received my stolen $80,000. I sat rigidly beside him, my chest tight, watching the large monitor, as he navigated through a complex hidden web of corporate registrations and financial databases. He typed furiously, his jaw clenched tight in anger. He explained to me in a low, steady voice that criminals often use anonymous shell companies to hide stolen funds, hoping to create a maze that the authorities cannot quickly follow. But Declan was not a sophisticated criminal mastermind. Declan was an arrogant, greedy amateur who genuinely believed he was smarter than the entire legal system. Ben accessed the official state business registry and ran a comprehensive search on the escrow company name listed on my bank statement. Within seconds, the system provided a direct hit. The company was completely legitimate. It was a high-profile brokerage firm that primarily handled multi-million-dollar real estate transactions in the downtown financial district. Ben then logged into a highly secure specialized real estate database that senior lawyers use to track pending property transfers before they are made available to the general public. He meticulously cross-referenced the escrow company with the legally registered name of my son-in-law. I watched closely as a long list of commercial properties and residential estates flashed rapidly across the screen. Ben filtered the search results by pending transactions scheduled for this current month. The system paused for a brief agonizing moment, calculating the vast amount of data. Then a single highly detailed property listing appeared on the right monitor. Ben leaned back in his heavy leather chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. He pointed a steady finger at the screen and told me that we had just found exactly where my grandson's stolen college fund had gone. I leaned forward and looked at the vivid, high-definition photographs dominating the top half of the screen. It was a massive, incredibly modern luxury condominium located in the most expensive exclusive skyscraper in the downtown commercial district. The pictures showed massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a private wraparound balcony overlooking the entire city skyline, a pristine white marble kitchen, and custom hardwood floors. It was the exact kind of opulent property that Thaddeus and elite corporate executives purchased to show off their immense wealth. I carefully read the listing price printed in bold black numbers at the top of the webpage. It was $1.2 million. My analytical mind struggled to comprehend the basic mathematics of what I was seeing. Declan was a mid-level marketing manager. He drove a leased car. He complained constantly about the cost of groceries. He could barely afford to pay his own basic credit card bills without constantly asking my daughter to beg me for a temporary loan. He had absolutely no financial capacity to purchase $1 million property, nor would any legitimate bank ever approve him for a mortgage of that massive size. Ben scrolled down to the confidential broker notes attached to the bottom of the listing. He read them aloud to me, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated disgust. The internal notes confirmed that a cash deposit of exactly $80,000 was received yesterday morning as an earnest money payment. This payment was made specifically to secure the condominium and immediately take it off the public market. The primary buyer was listed as Declan Reed. Declan had stolen the Sacred Life insurance money my late wife had left behind and immediately used it as a down payment to buy himself a millionaire lifestyle. But an $80,000 deposit was only a tiny fraction of the total purchase price. Declan still needed well over $1 million in pure cash to actually close the deal and take physical possession of the luxury condominium. I looked at Ben completely bewildered by the sheer scale of the financial mechanics and asked him how Declan planned to secure the rest of the massive funds. Ben did not answer me immediately. His eyes darkened with a terrifying realization. He turned back to his computer keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys with a renewed, almost violent intensity. Ben opened another portal this time, logging directly into the Municipal Property Tax and Deed Registry database. He typed in the exact street address of my own home, the beautiful 4-bedroom house I had built with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. He hit the search button with a heavy strike of his finger. The screen refreshed instantly, displaying the official tax records and the current legal status of my residential property. A bright red banner stretched completely across the top of my property file. The banner read, "Pending Sale." I felt the warm blood completely drain from my face. My stomach twisted into a painful, nauseating knot that made it difficult to breathe. Ben clicked on the red banner to open the attached commercial sales contract. The digital document loaded, slowly revealing a massive, legally binding real estate transaction. My family house was not being sold to another young family looking to build a life. It was being sold to a massive, aggressive corporate development firm that specialized in buying old properties, demolishing them completely, and building high-density luxury townhouses in their place. I stared in absolute paralyzing horror at the purchase price listed on the second page of the contract, $800,000. The corporate buyer was paying entirely in liquid cash to expedite the process, and the person listed as the authorized seller, utilizing the forged power of attorney to completely bypass my knowledge and legal consent, was Declan. He had literally sold my family home. He had sold the sacred place where my wife and I had raised our only daughter. He had sold the living room, where we celebrated countless birthdays, the backyard, where I taught my grandson how to throw a baseball. The very walls that held every single precious memory of my entire adult life. He had sold it all to a soulless, faceless corporation to be mercilessly bulldozed into the dirt. The sickening puzzle pieces finally snapped together in my mind, creating a picture of pure evil. Declan was using the $800,000 cash payout from the sale of my house to fund the remaining balance of his luxury downtown condominium. He planned to render me completely homeless, steal my entire net worth, and live like a king in a glass tower using my money. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was almost impossible to process. Ben scrolled silently to the very bottom of the commercial sales contract, searching for the agreed-upon dates of execution. He stopped scrolling and highlighted a single line of text in bright blue. He pointed his silver pen directly at the screen, tapping the glass monitor to ensure I understood the urgency. The official closing date for the sale of my house was listed as December 31st. Today was December 26th. I stared at the date on the screen, the terrifying gravity of the situation crushing down on my chest like a physical weight. We had exactly 4 days. In exactly 4 days, the corporate developers would wire $800,000 into a bank account controlled entirely by my son-in-law. He would then instantly transfer those stolen funds to the downtown escrow company to finalize the purchase of his luxury condo. In 4 days, I would legally lose ownership of my home. I would lose my life savings, and I would be left wandering the freezing streets with absolutely nothing to my name. Declan had timed everything perfectly. He had planned this massive financial assassination around the chaos of the holiday season, knowing full well that banks' law offices and government buildings operated on heavily limited schedules. He knew people would be distracted by family gatherings and holiday shopping. He thought his master plan was completely flawless. He thought he had successfully trapped a weak, helpless old man who would be too confused and heartbroken to fight back. But Declan made one critical, fatal miscalculation in his grand design. He left me alive. I looked away from the computer monitor and looked directly into the eyes of my oldest friend. I did not feel any fear anymore. The initial shock and the deep emotional pain had completely burned away, leaving behind nothing but a cold, absolute, and unyielding resolve. I told Ben that we had 4 days to build a trap that Declan could never escape. The drive back to my neighborhood felt completely different than the escape the night before. I was no longer a confused, heartbroken father fleeing a ruined holiday dinner. I was a man returning to an active war zone, carrying the absolute certainty of my enemy's destruction. I pulled my car into the driveway of my property. The bright exterior security lights were blazing against the dark winter sky. The warm, inviting glow of the living room lamps spilled out across the thick layer of snow on the front lawn. Declan had obviously found the main breaker panel and restored the electrical power to the house shortly after my departure. The house looked perfectly normal, from the outside a picture of quiet suburban peace. But I knew the foundation was entirely infected with rot. I turned off the engine and sat in the cold car for a long moment, steadying my breathing and forcing my racing heart to slow down. I had to perfectly play the role of the defeated old man. I had to let them believe their master plan was working flawlessly so they would not panic and change their timeline. I grabbed my house keys, walked slowly up the front steps, and unlocked the heavy oak door. The warm air of the hallway hit my face, carrying the stale, lingering smell of spilled red wine and cold roasted meat from the disastrous dinner party. The house was unnervingly quiet, a stark contrast to the shouting I had left behind. I took off my heavy winter coat and hung it carefully on its designated hook in the front closet. I did not call out to announce my arrival. I did not want to speak to anyone. I simply started walking toward the kitchen to get a glass of water, hoping to slip into my bedroom unnoticed. I did not even make it past the wide living room archway before Declan stepped out from the shadows of the staircase. He had clearly been waiting for me to return. He wore a crisp white dress shirt and dark tailored slacks, looking incredibly smug and self-assured. He stepped directly into the center of the hallway, crossing his muscular arms over his chest, adopting the exact same physically intimidating posture he had used the night before at the dining table. But this time, there was no audience of extended family members to perform for. It was just the two of us standing in the quiet house. Declan did not waste his time with pleasantries or fake apologies. He stepped closer to me, aggressively invading my personal space. He pointed a long, accusing finger directly at my chest. He told me that my little electrical stunt last night had completely ruined his mother's holiday experience. He said his parents had been forced to leave the house early because the rooms were freezing cold, and he was absolutely furious about the deep embarrassment I had caused him. I looked at him with a blank, unreadable expression, letting my silence stretch out to make him uncomfortable. My total lack of a verbal response only fueled his arrogant anger. Declan leaned down, bringing his face mere inches from mine, and lowered his voice into a vicious, deeply threatening whisper. He told me that I was clearly losing my mind in my old age. He said my memory was rapidly failing, and my erratic behavior was becoming completely dangerous to the safety of his family. He promised me that if I ever tried another pathetic stunt like shutting off the power again, he would make one single phone call to a state medical board. He threatened to have me officially declared legally incompetent by a corrupt doctor of his choosing. He smiled a cruel, cold smile and told me he had already picked out a state-funded low-income nursing facility 2 towns over. He described it in brutal detail as a miserable place where they lock the heavy metal doors from the outside and ignore the elderly patients for hours at a time. He said he would drop me off at their front desk, sign the admission papers, and never visit me again for the rest of my life. Declan desperately wanted a fight. He wanted me to scream to loudly deny his terrifying accusations, or to break down crying and beg him not to lock me away in a medical facility. He was actively trying to manufacture a documented history of mental instability to easily justify the forged power of attorney he was already using to steal my entire life. I knew exactly what twisted game he was playing, and I completely refused to participate in his trap. I did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of fear or hesitation. I simply shifted my gaze slightly to the right, looking directly past his broad shoulder down the long hallway. The interior door leading to the attached 2-car garage was wide open. The harsh fluorescent lights inside the garage were glaring brightly. Stacked neatly against the far concrete wall were dozens of heavy-duty brown cardboard moving boxes. Several of them were already sealed tightly with thick, clear packing tape. I could clearly see my own handwriting on the side of a large blue plastic storage bin sitting next to the growing wall of boxes. It was the specific bin containing my late wife's fragile porcelain collection and my old engineering college textbooks. Declan was not just secretly planning to sell the house on December 31st. He was actively packing my entire physical life into cardboard boxes while I was out of the house meeting with my lawyer. He was meticulously erasing my presence from the property, preparing to throw my precious memories into a cheap rental storage unit or a garbage dumpster, the exact moment the corporate developers wired the $800,000 into his stolen bank account. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his actions was almost difficult to comprehend. He truly thought I was entirely oblivious to the massive trap closing around my neck. I slowly looked back into Declan's dark eyes. I gave him a weak, tired, and deeply submissive nod, perfectly playing the part of a broken, exhausted elder who had finally surrendered to a much stronger predator. Declan smirked widely, visibly satisfied with his perceived victory over me, and stepped aside to let me pass through the hallway. I walked slowly past him toward the kitchen, my heart pounding against my ribs with a cold, highly controlled fury. As I reached the marble kitchen island, I heard soft, hurried footsteps rushing up behind me. I turned around and saw my daughter, Serena. Her eyes were bright red and heavily swollen from hours of crying. She looked terrible and exhausted, wearing an oversized gray sweater and clutching a crumpled white tissue in her trembling hands. She looked quickly over her shoulder into the hallway to ensure Declan was no longer standing there listening before she stepped very close to me. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her grip surprisingly tight and desperate. Fresh tears spilled over her eyelashes and ran down her pale cheeks. She begged me in a frantic, breathy whisper to just listen to Declan and do whatever he said. She pleaded with me to stop fighting him, to stop causing unnecessary tension in the house, and to just blindly cooperate with whatever changes he demanded over the next few days. She sobbed quietly, wiping her nose with the tissue, telling me that Declan was working on a massive life-changing business deal that was going to permanently secure their financial future. She looked me right in the eyes and confessed that their marriage had been rapidly falling apart under the intense stress of living in my house. But this brand new real estate opportunity was finally going to fix all of their problems and save her broken family. The warm kitchen suddenly felt freezing cold. The very last remaining shred of unconditional hope I held for my daughter instantly turned to ash and blew away. Serena was not an innocent, naive victim, being kept entirely in the dark by a cruel, manipulative husband. She knew about the massive real estate deal. She might not have specifically known about the forged signature on the legal documents or the stolen life insurance money. But she absolutely knew Declan was planning a massive financial maneuver using my personal assets to buy them a brand new life. She had somehow convinced herself that sacrificing my home, my financial security, and my personal dignity was a perfectly acceptable price to pay to keep her toxic husband from filing for divorce. She was actively begging me to willingly walk into my own execution, just so she could pretend her perfect suburban marriage was successful. I gently but firmly pulled my arm out of her desperate, clinging grip. I looked at the child I had raised from birth and felt absolutely nothing but a hollow, crushing emptiness in my chest. She had clearly chosen her side in this war. The line was officially drawn in the sand, and she was standing directly next to the enemy. I realized in that exact devastating moment that I could no longer just punish Declan for his crimes. If I was going to truly protect my innocent grandson and secure what remained of my legacy, I had to completely destroy them both. I did not sleep for a second night in a row. At the exact moment, the pale freezing sun began to rise over the quiet snow-covered city. The next morning, I was already sitting in the heavy leather guest chair inside Ben's private law office. I had called his personal cell phone during my short drive over from the house and recounted every single terrifying detail of the confrontation in the dark hallway. I told him about the massive stack of heavy brown cardboard moving boxes sitting in my own garage. I described the specific blue plastic storage bin that held my late wife's fragile porcelain collection, a collection Declan was carelessly preparing to throw away. Most painfully, I told him about the pathetic, desperate tears of my own daughter, as she actively begged me to simply surrender my entire life and my personal dignity to her husband. I told him how Serena had chosen to protect her failing marriage over my safety. Ben was absolutely furious when I finished the story. His face was flushed with a deep, angry red that contrasted sharply with his gray hair. He paced violently back and forth across the entire length of his large office, his expensive leather dress shoes squeaking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. He was no longer acting like a calm, collected, and professional real estate attorney. He was acting like a fiercely protective brother, preparing for a vicious physical fight. He abruptly stopped pacing, walked over to his large mahogany desk, and slammed both of his hands down flat against the smooth wood. He looked me right in the eyes and declared in a booming voice that we were going to the local police precinct right this very second. He stated loudly that he personally knew the commanding officer of the Financial Crimes Unit, a man he had worked with for over 20 years, and that we could have Declan arrested for forgery and elder abuse before the local banks even opened their doors for the day. Ben aggressively grabbed his heavy winter coat from the brass coat rack in the corner and ordered me to get up from the chair. He wanted to instantly freeze the downtown escrow account, completely cancel the pending commercial sale of my house, and throw Declan into a cold concrete holding cell immediately. He firmly believed that deploying swift, overwhelming, and immediate legal force was the only acceptable way to protect me from the massive financial threat hanging over my head. I did not move a single muscle. I remained sitting perfectly still in the leather chair, my hands resting calmly and quietly on my lap. I looked up at my oldest, dearest friend and softly told him to put his coat away and sit back down. Ben stared at me in absolute shock, holding his thick winter coat, suspended in midair, completely unable to comprehend why a victim of massive fraud was openly refusing to go to the police. I took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart and carefully explained the fatal, catastrophic flaw in his aggressive plan. I spoke with the cold, calculated, and entirely detached precision of a senior civil engineer diagnosing a hidden structural weakness in a massive concrete bridge. I explained that if we went to the local police detectives right now, Declan would absolutely not face the total, uncompromising destruction he rightfully deserved. He was a wealthy-looking, smooth-talking, and highly manipulative young man with absolutely no prior criminal record. The moment the police knocked on his door, he would immediately hire a slick defense attorney and confidently claim that the entire situation was simply a massive, unfortunate family misunderstanding. He would boldly lie to the investigators and say that I had willingly and knowingly signed the power of attorney several months ago and simply forgot about it because of my rapidly advancing age. The most sickening part of the reality was that my own daughter, Serena, would likely stand up in a public courtroom and falsely testify under oath that I was suffering from severe memory loss and dementia, validating the exact threat Declan had whispered to me in the hallway. The local county prosecutor would look at the incredibly messy emotional family dynamic and likely offer Declan a very generous quiet plea deal to avoid a lengthy public trial. Declan would ultimately get a pathetic slap on the wrist. He would receive a few short years of basic probation, complete some minor community service at a local charity, and he would walk completely free. He would remain comfortably married to my daughter. He would stay living in my house, and he would simply wait in the shadows until he found another more secure way to steal my money. I looked Ben directly in the eyes and told him that I absolutely refused to let this parasite escape with a minor inconvenience. I did not want to simply stop the corporate sale of my house. I wanted Declan to confidently walk right into a massive, inescapable federal trap from which he could never ever recover. I wanted him to commit an irreversible, massive financial crime that carried a mandatory lengthy prison sentence. I explained my master plan. If we intentionally let him finalize the commercial sale on December 31st, the exact moment he authorized the electronic transfer of $800, 000, across state banking lines, using a completely forged document, the crime automatically escalated from local county forgery to massive federal wire fraud. I did not want local police officers knocking on his door. I wanted the Federal Bureau of Investigation heavily involved. I wanted him facing a mandatory decade behind thick concrete walls, completely stripped of his arrogant pride and his stolen wealth. Ben slowly lowered his heavy winter coat, the anger draining from his face. He stared at me in total silence for a very long time, his eyes wide with a complex mixture of profound shock, slight fear, and deep undeniable respect. He slowly walked back around his large mahogany desk and sat down heavily in his leather executive chair. The protective, angry friend completely vanished from his posture, and the ruthless, brilliant, and highly calculating attorney returned to the surface. He nodded his head in silent, complete agreement. He understood exactly what kind of machine I was building. We were no longer simply playing defense to protect my retirement assets. We were meticulously engineering a flawless, devastating financial execution. Ben cracked his knuckles loudly and pulled his large computer keyboard closer to the edge of the desk. He told me that if we were truly going to let Declan push the massive house sale all the way to the final holiday closing date, we needed to secretly and entirely strip him of his legal armor without him ever realizing he was suddenly vulnerable. Ben opened a blank, highly secured legal document template on his right computer monitor. He began to rapidly type, drafting the ultimate silent weapon of our retaliation. It was an official, legally binding revocation of power of attorney. This single piece of paper was perfectly designed to be a lethal, invisible countermeasure. Ben carefully explained the complex legal mechanics as his fingers flew aggressively across the mechanical keyboard. This new document would explicitly, completely, and permanently terminate the forged authority Declan had illegally filed with the county clerk 2 weeks ago. The document would state in absolute, undeniable, and medically sound terms that I was in full, perfect possession of my mental faculties, and that any and all previous proxies mandates or authorizations were immediately rendered null and void under the full penalty of perjury. But the absolute true genius of this specific legal document was its complete secrecy. Ben meticulously structured the revocation so that it did not legally require Declan to sign, it acknowledge it, or even receive direct physical notification for it to become actively enforced by the state. We were going to pull the critical safety net completely out from under his feet while he was standing confidently on the highest wire, leaving him to fall to his absolute destruction. Ben printed the heavy, dense legal document on thick, expensive watermarked paper. He placed the 4 pages carefully on the wooden desk directly in front of me and handed me his favorite heavy silver fountain pen. I read every single printed word with an immense, satisfying sense of impending justice. I pressed the cold tip of the silver pen to the paper and signed my full legal name on the dotted line. My signature was sharp, steady, and completely authentic, a beautiful and stark contrast to the pathetic, shaky forgery Declan had submitted to the county. Ben immediately took the document from my hands, pressed his heavy official steel notary seal deep into the bottom corner of the page, and signed his own name with a flourish as the legally binding witness. The document was now fully armed and incredibly dangerous. Ben did not simply put the pages in an envelope and mail the revocation. waiting for the slow, incompetent government bureaucracy to eventually process it. He bypassed the public system entirely. He accessed the direct, expedited, and highly secure digital filing portal reserved strictly for senior state attorneys and judges. He uploaded the high-resolution digital scans of the newly signed revocation directly into the Central State Registry database. We both sat in tense silence and watched the bright green progress bar move slowly across the computer screen. A loud, sharp electronic beep suddenly echoed from the computer speakers. The state system generated a bright red 12-digit confirmation number. The document was officially legally recorded and permanently bound to my public financial record. The trap was perfectly set and completely hidden. The forged power of attorney that Declan deeply believed gave him absolute unquestionable control over my entire life and my property was now completely worthless. It was nothing more than a dead, empty piece of paper floating in the system. But because we filed the revocation directly with the secure state registry, Declan would receive absolutely no warning or notification. He would confidently walk right into the downtown title company on New Year's Eve, wearing his expensive suit, completely believing he held the absolute power of a king. He would be totally unaware that he was legally nothing more than a common, desperate criminal committing a massive federal offense on high-definition security cameras. I leaned back in the comfortable leather chair, feeling a dark cold. An entirely unfamiliar smile touched the corners of my mouth. The board was perfectly set. The pieces were moving exactly where I wanted them to go. Now I just had to return to my house and flawlessly play the pathetic role of the defeated, broken victim for 3 more agonizing days. I drove back to my house with the absolute certainty of a man who had just secretly rigged a massive concrete bridge to collapse. I pulled into the driveway, parked my car in the garage next to the towering stacks of cardboard moving boxes, and walked through the interior door with my shoulders intentionally slumped forward. I let out a long, heavy sigh that echoed loudly in the quiet hallway, perfectly broadcasting my manufactured despair to anyone listening. I walked straight up the carpeted stairs to my master bedroom, making sure my footsteps sounded incredibly heavy, slow, and entirely tired. I went to the very back of my deep walk-in closet and pulled out a battered, faded brown leather suitcase that I had not used in over a decade. I carried it like it weighed 100 pounds, placed it gently on the center of my large bed, and unzipped it with visibly trembling hands. I walked over to my heavy oak dresser and began pulling out thick winter sweaters, plain cotton shirts, and a few pairs of simple trousers. I folded them slowly, deliberately, acting like a man whose entire spirit and will to live had been completely crushed into fine dust. I made absolutely sure the bedroom door remained wide open to the hallway. I needed a captive audience for this pathetic performance. I needed my son-in-law to walk past that door and see with his own 2 eyes that his cruel threats from the night before had successfully broken my resistance. I packed a small, worn leather toiletry bag with my shaving kit, my toothbrush, and my daily blood pressure medication. Every single slow, agonizing physical movement was a carefully calculated lie. Inside my mind, I felt incredibly sharp, highly energized, and completely dangerous. But on the outside, I was perfectly portraying a sad, confused 66-year-old man, preparing to be discarded by his own family like a bag of worthless garbage. It did not take very long for the predator to smell the blood in the water. Within 20 minutes, I heard the arrogant, heavy footsteps of my son-in-law marching down the upstairs hallway. Declan stopped directly in the open doorway of my bedroom. I did not look up from my task. I kept my eyes focused downward on the faded brown suitcase, slowly and methodically, smoothing out the wrinkles in a gray wool sweater. I heard the sharp, distinct clinking of ice cubes against heavy crystal. Declan was casually drinking a large glass of my most expensive aged single malt scotch, openly celebrating his twisted victory in the middle of the afternoon. He leaned comfortably against the wooden doorframe, took a slow, highly exaggerated sip of the stolen liquor, and let out a dark, mocking chuckle. He told me that he was genuinely glad to see I had finally decided to be reasonable and accept the harsh reality of my situation. He stated that my decision to start packing early was very mature, completely ignoring the horrifying fact that he was forcing me out of my own home under the threat of being locked in a secure medical ward. He took another long drink of the expensive scotch and arrogantly suggested that I should only pack my absolute basic necessities. He reminded me with a cruel, cold smile playing on his lips that the low-income state facility he had selected for me had extremely limited closet space. He actually had the sheer, breathtaking audacity to tell me that I would not need my nice tailored suits or my expensive leather dress shoes anymore, because my brand new life would consist entirely of sitting in a plastic chair staring at a blank television screen all day. I forced my hands to shake slightly as I placed another folded shirt into the suitcase. I softly told him that I understood perfectly. I kept my voice weak, entirely devoid of any anger, resentment, or resistance. Declan smiled a wide, deeply predatory smile, completely intoxicated by his absolute perceived power over my entire existence. Suddenly, the sharp melodic ringing of the front doorbell echoed loudly through the large house. Declan immediately straightened his posture, his smug smile shifting rapidly into a look of serious, aggressive business confidence. He quickly swallowed the rest of the expensive scotch, placed the empty crystal glass carelessly on my antique hallway console table, and practically ran down the stairs to open the door. I completely stopped pretending to pack the suitcase. I walked silently out of my bedroom and stood quietly in the dark shadows at the very top of the wooden staircase, looking directly down into the brightly lit front foyer. Declan swung the heavy oak front door open to reveal three men dressed in sharp, meticulously tailored business suits and thick black wool overcoats. They were the corporate real estate developers. They did not look like men who cared about precious family memories or beautiful suburban architecture. They looked like cold, highly efficient financial predators looking for their next profitable meal. Declan greeted them with excessive, almost embarrassing enthusiasm, shaking their hands vigorously and welcoming them into the house as if he had personally built the foundation with his own two hands. He loudly invited them to take a final comprehensive walkthrough of the entire property before the fast-approaching holiday closing date. The lead developer, a tall man with sleek silver hair and a completely humorless expression, stepped inside the foyer and immediately began pointing at the interior walls. He did not admire the custom woodwork or the expensive imported light fixtures I had installed for my late wife. He turned to his younger associates and started casually discussing which structural load-bearing walls needed to be completely demolished first. He talked loudly about tearing up the massive ancient oak trees in the front yard to make room for a paved concrete parking lot for the new construction. They were actively, mercilessly dissecting my beloved family home right in front of my eyes, treating my entire life's work like nothing more than an annoying physical obstacle standing in the way of their new luxury high-density townhouse project. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the upper hallway, carefully controlling my breathing, watching the disgusting display of unchecked corporate greed happening in my own living room. Declan walked closely beside the lead developer, eagerly answering all of their structural questions and nodding his head repeatedly like an obedient, desperate dog. After 20 agonizing minutes of aggressively measuring the downstairs rooms, tapping on the drywall, and taking bright digital photographs of the property, the group returned to the main foyer right at the bottom of the stairs. The lead developer pulled a thick black leather portfolio from his expensive briefcase. He looked directly at Declan and stated in a loud, highly commanding voice that the physical property inspections were fully complete and entirely satisfactory to their corporate board. He confirmed that their legal purchasing department had successfully reviewed all the necessary documents Declan had provided earlier that week. The developer was completely unaware that the power of attorney they were heavily relying on to execute this massive transaction was now entirely legally void and worthless. The silver-haired developer extended his right hand toward my son-in-law. He stated clearly, articulating every single word, that the total agreed purchase price of $800,000 in liquid cash would be electronically wired directly into Declan's specified escrow account at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning on December 31st. Declan eagerly reached out and grabbed the man's hand, shaking it firmly with both of his own. Declan smiled so widely I thought his jaw would physically break. He thanked the developer profusely, practically vibrating with greedy, uncontrollable anticipation. He had just verbally confirmed the exact time, the exact date, and the exact financial mechanism of his own absolute destruction. I watched the three developers turn around, walk out the front door, and drive away down the street in their expensive black luxury vehicles. Declan locked the heavy deadbolt behind them, spun around to face the empty hallway, and aggressively pumped his fist in the air, silently celebrating his massive stolen holiday payday. He truly thought he had just successfully stolen $800,000 and permanently secured his brand new life in a downtown $1 million luxury penthouse. He had absolutely no idea that he had just forcefully shaken hands on a massive federal wire fraud charge that carried a mandatory decade in a concrete prison cell. I quietly turned around and walked back into my master bedroom. I looked down at the pathetic brown suitcase sitting on my mattress. I did not need to fold another shirt or pack another bag. The carefully crafted illusion of my complete surrender was absolutely flawless. The trap was perfectly baited. The arrogant criminal had eagerly taken a massive bite, and all I had to do now was wait patiently for the steel jaws to violently snap shut. I waited until the early evening when the house was completely dominated by the loud, obnoxious sounds of a professional football game blaring from the living room television. Declan was sprawled across the large sofa I had purchased for them, completely absorbed in the game, shouting aggressively at the screen, with a fresh bottle of imported beer in his hand. I used his distraction to quietly slip out through the heavy wooden back door. I walked silently down the dark, snow-covered alleyway, running behind our suburban street, my boots crunching softly against the frozen ice. I got into my car, which I had purposefully parked 2 blocks away from my property earlier that afternoon. I could not risk Declan looking out the window, seeing my vehicle leaving the driveway, and getting suspicious about my movements during my supposed period of quiet surrender. 48 hours earlier, right after Ben and I had discovered the $1 million luxury condominium listing on his office computer, I had gone to a completely separate local bank where I maintained a small private checking account. I had withdrawn several thousand in untraceable cash. I used that money to immediately hire a highly recommended and incredibly discreet private investigator. I needed to know exactly what Declan was doing at that massive downtown property. I drove slowly through the freezing city streets, carefully navigating toward a dimly lit and entirely empty concrete parking garage located on the far east side of the commercial financial district. The air inside the structure was freezing cold, and the thick concrete walls echoed with the low, distant hum of city traffic. A dark gray sedan was parked in the very back corner of the second level, completely hidden from the main street view. I pulled up slowly and parked my car directly next to it, keeping my headlights turned off. A tall man wearing a dark wool peacoat stepped out of the sedan and quickly slid into the passenger seat of my car. His name was Lawrence. He was a retired state police detective who now made a very lucrative and quiet living, exposing the dark and heavily guarded secrets of wealthy corporate executives. He did not waste any time with polite introductions or warm holiday greetings. He carried a thick, heavy manila envelope in his dark, leather-gloved hands. He reached up and turned on the small overhead dome light in my car, illuminating the tight, freezing space with a harsh, unforgiving yellow glow. He looked at me with a deeply sympathetic and heavy expression, a specific look that instantly made my stomach drop into my shoes. He told me that he had been maintaining uninterrupted physical surveillance on my son-in-law and the downtown luxury condominium building for the past 2 full days. He took a slow breath and warned me to mentally brace myself before he opened the package. Before I reveal what was inside that envelope, comment the number 7 below, so I know you're still here with me in this story. Your support means more than you think. And just a quick note, parts of the next section include dramatized elements created for storytelling and reflection. If that's not something you enjoy, feel free to stop watching here. Lawrence slowly unwound the red string sealing the manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of glossy, high-resolution surveillance photographs. He laid the first few pictures out across the center console of my car, smoothing them down with his gloved hand. The images were incredibly clear, taken with a highly sophisticated telephoto lens. The first photograph showed the massive towering glass front doors of the luxury condominium building. Declan was standing perfectly in the center of the frame, wearing his expensive tailored winter coat. He looked incredibly happy, flashing his bright, arrogant, and highly confident smile. I stared at the image, my mind desperately trying to make sense of the situation. I fully expected the next photograph to show him walking into the beautiful building with a professional real estate agent, perhaps holding a tape measure to plan the dimensions of the living room or sketching out exactly where to put my grandson's heavy wooden toy boxes. I genuinely thought his sickening master plan was simply to ruthlessly steal my money to forcefully upgrade his family's living situation. But as Lawrence silently laid down the second and third photographs, the cold, terrifying reality of the situation crashed over me like a massive tidal wave of freezing water. Declan was absolutely not alone in the pictures. He was standing very close to a young, remarkably beautiful woman. She appeared to be no older than 24 years old, with long, flowing blonde hair, wearing a very expensive designer leather jacket and tall boots. In the third photograph, Declan had his arm wrapped tightly and intimately around her waist, pulling her incredibly close to his body as they walked confidently together through the polished white marble lobby of the luxury building. Lawrence tapped the third photograph with his index finger and began to calmly explain the horrific situation. He told me the young woman's name was Valerie. She was a junior marketing assistant at the exact same corporate firm where Declan currently worked. Lawrence explained in a steady voice that Declan and this young woman had been heavily involved in a secret and deeply intimate romantic affair for the past 8 months. Declan had been quietly funding her luxurious high-end lifestyle, using the various credit cards he constantly forced my daughter to pay off with her own salary. Lawrence continued to place more photographs on the console, each one significantly more devastating and undeniable than the last. There were vivid pictures of Declan and the young woman sitting incredibly close together at an exclusive downtown restaurant, drinking tall glasses of imported champagne and laughing loudly into the night. There were pictures of them walking hand in hand out of a high-end modern furniture boutique located in the wealthy shopping district. Lawrence pointed his finger to a specific highly detailed photograph, showing Declan aggressively signing a digital delivery clipboard held by a tired moving truck driver. Lawrence explained that Declan was currently having tens of thousands of dollars worth of brand new custom-built Italian furniture delivered directly into the luxury condominium penthouse. He was heavily furnishing the massive, beautiful suite to the exact demanding specifications of his young mistress. I stared at the glossy photographs, my bare hands gripping the cold leather steering wheel of my car so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white and my joints ached with pressure. I desperately scanned the images looking for any sign or any tiny hidden detail that indicated Declan was making space for his actual family. I looked at Lawrence and asked him, my voice barely a rough whisper, if there was any evidence of a child's bedroom being prepared, or any indication that my daughter Serena was ever brought to the property to see it. Lawrence shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with quiet pity. He stated with absolute heartbreaking certainty that there was absolutely no room for a 7-year-old boy in that modern penthouse. He told me he had legally accessed the building's internal security registry database earlier that morning. Declan had formally registered exactly 2 permanent electronic key fobs for the secure private elevators. He registered one for himself and one for the young blonde woman. The master plan was now completely laid bare before my eyes, and it was infinitely more evil and more destructive than I had ever possibly imagined. Declan was absolutely not planning to sell my house and move his wife and child into a bigger, better home. He was planning to steal the massive $800,000 cash payout from the corporate developers, successfully finalize the purchase of the luxury condo entirely for himself and his mistress, and completely vanish into the city. The sheer meticulously calculated cruelty of his grand design was almost impossible for my engineering mind to fully comprehend. Declan fully intended to let the ruthless corporate developers bulldoze my beloved family home into the dirt, intentionally leaving me completely homeless and totally destitute in the freezing winter. But he also fully intended to completely abandon his own loyal wife and his innocent young son without a single penny to their names. Serena had been standing right in front of me in my warm kitchen just yesterday, sobbing heavily and begging me to blindly cooperate with Declan because she genuinely believed this massive real estate deal was going to permanently save their failing marriage. She was completely blind to the terrifying fact that her husband was actively using her as a disposable human shield while he meticulously built his luxurious escape pod. He was going to leave her standing completely alone in the snow on New Year's Day, with absolutely nothing but a shattered heart and a mountain of unpaid debt. I felt a deep, powerful, and entirely consuming surge of pure adrenaline flood my veins, entirely replacing the cold shock with a burning, unyielding fury. I carefully gathered the large stack of glossy photographs, placed them gently back inside the heavy manila envelope, and securely wrapped the red string around the paper clasp. I reached into my coat pocket, handed Lawrence the remaining balance of his payment in thick cash bills, and thanked him sincerely for his incredible vital work. He simply nodded, his head stepped out of my car, and disappeared completely into the dark shadows of the concrete parking garage. I sat entirely alone in the quiet vehicle for a long time, resting my hand heavily on the thick manila envelope sitting on the passenger seat. I now held the absolute ultimate weapon. These photographs were the lethal, undeniable ammunition I needed to completely destroy the pathetic illusion of Declan's perfect marriage and absolutely crush his arrogant spirit right in front of my daughter. The evidence was irrefutable, but my mind quickly reminded me of the critical and incredibly dangerous reality of premature detonation. If I drove back to the house right now, kicked open the front door, and violently threw these glossy pictures onto the living room coffee table, the massive emotional explosion would instantly derail the entire legal operation. Declan would completely panic. He would immediately cancel the commercial house sale. He would completely hide my stolen $80,000 in untraceable offshore accounts. And he would entirely avoid committing the massive federal wire fraud that specifically carried the mandatory decade in a concrete prison cell. I had to maintain my absolute agonizing silence. I had to drive back to my house, walk through the front door, look directly into the eyes of the arrogant monster who was actively planning to destroy my entire family, and say absolutely nothing to betray my knowledge. I had to hold this devastating weapon tightly against my chest and time the explosion perfectly. I had to ensure that the federal agents, the bank managers, and my entirely shattered daughter all witnessed his complete, inescapable destruction at the exact same terrifying moment on the morning of December 31st. The morning of December 31st broke with a bitter freezing wind that rattled the bedroom windows of my home. I woke up long before the sun even attempted to pierce through the heavy gray winter clouds. Today was the day. The final hours of the year were ticking away, and the massive federal trap I had spent the last 4 days meticulously building was finally armed and ready to be triggered. I lay perfectly still in my bed for a few moments, listening to the familiar sounds of my house waking up for what I knew would be the very last time under these terrifying conditions. Down the hall, I heard the heavy, aggressive footsteps of my son-in-law, moving quickly between his bedroom and the master bathroom. Declan was not moving like a man who was simply going to a standard holiday business meeting. He was moving with the frantic, highly energized pace of a man who firmly believed he was about to conquer the entire world. I slowly got out of bed, put on my simple wool sweater and corduroy trousers, and walked down the stairs to the kitchen to brew a pot of black coffee. I sat quietly at the marble island, waiting for the performance to begin. 10 minutes later, Declan walked into the kitchen, and the sheer arrogance radiating from his body was genuinely suffocating. He was dressed in a brand new, incredibly expensive dark navy bespoke suit that fit his shoulders perfectly. He wore a crisp white silk shirt, a silver silk tie, and a pair of highly polished black leather shoes that clicked sharply against the kitchen floor tiles. He looked exactly like a millionaire corporate executive stepping out of the pages of a luxury magazine. He had obviously purchased this entire outfit entirely on credit, arrogantly anticipating the massive $800, 000 cash wire transfer that was scheduled to hit his stolen escrow account in just a few short hours. He walked straight past me, without offering a simple good morning, opened the refrigerator, and grabbed a bottle of expensive imported sparkling water. He leaned against the counter, crossed his ankles, and looked down at me with an expression of absolute unadulterated contempt. He truly believed he was the undisputed king of my castle, standing triumphantly over the broken, pathetic ruins of my long life. Declan took a slow sip of his sparkling water and checked the heavy gold watch on his left wrist. He looked at me with a cold smile, entirely devoid of empathy. He told me to make absolutely sure all of my pathetic brown cardboard boxes were securely taped and stacked by the front door before he returned home this afternoon. He spoke to me slowly and loudly, using the exact same condescending tone a frustrated teacher would use to scold a very slow, disobedient child. He proudly announced that he had personally finalized all the necessary intake paperwork for my permanent relocation. He stated that a cheap medical transport van was scheduled to arrive at my driveway at exactly noon tomorrow, right on New Year's Day. He described the van in vicious detail, telling me it was the kind they used to haul away indigent patients who had absolutely no family left to care for them. He wanted me to fully understand the absolute bleakness of my immediate future. He ordered me to be sitting quietly on the front porch with my single brown suitcase when the van pulled up, strictly forbidding me from making a dramatic emotional scene in front of the neighbors. He warned me that if I caused any trouble or refused to get inside the transport vehicle, he would completely cut off my access to my grandson Mason forever. He used the child I loved more than anything in the world as a final cruel weapon to ensure my total obedience. I sat at the kitchen island staring down into the dark reflection of my black coffee. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply gave him a slow, highly defeated nod of my head. My silent submission was exactly the fuel his massive ego desperately required. He chuckled darkly, placed the empty water bottle on the counter, and turned his back on me to grab his leather briefcase from the hallway table. At that exact moment, my daughter Serena walked into the kitchen. She was wearing a thick pink fleece robe, her hair tied up in a messy morning bun. She looked incredibly tired, but there was a forced, desperate sense of hopeful excitement completely taking over her face. She walked directly past me, entirely ignoring my presence, and went straight to her husband. She threw her arms around Declan's neck and kissed him deeply. She stepped back, straightening his silver silk tie with her hands, and looked up at him with eyes full of absolute blind devotion. She told him how incredibly handsome he looked in his new expensive suit. She wished him the best of luck on his massive business closing today. She actually smiled a genuine bright smile and told him that she was so incredibly proud of how hard he was working to permanently secure their family's financial future. The level of tragic, sickening irony echoing through the warm kitchen was almost too much to bear. She was actively praising the very monster who was silently plotting to completely destroy her entire existence. I watched her caress his cheek, entirely unaware that the man she was kissing was currently holding a secure digital key fob for a downtown luxury penthouse that belonged exclusively to his young blonde mistress. She had absolutely no idea that while she was busy thanking him for saving their marriage, he was meticulously planning to walk out of the title company with $800, 000 in stolen cash, and never return to this house again. She was eagerly helping him load the gun that he was going to point directly at her heart. Declan smiled back at her, a flawless, charming, and completely terrifying performance. He kissed her forehead, promised her they would celebrate with an expensive dinner tonight, and told her he loved her. The lie rolled off his tongue so easily, so naturally, that it made my blood run completely cold. Declan turned around and walked out the front door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind him with a loud final thud. I listened to the powerful engine of his leased car start in the driveway and slowly back out into the freezing winter street. Serena stood by the front window, happily watching him drive away toward his grand destiny. She let out a long, contented sigh, turned around, and finally looked at me, sitting at the kitchen island. Her smile instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened expression of mild annoyance. She reminded me sharply that I needed to finish packing my things before the transport van arrived tomorrow. She told me not to ruin Declan's celebratory mood tonight by crying or complaining about my new living arrangements. She then turned her back on me and walked upstairs to wake up my grandson. The total disregard she showed for my humanity cemented my resolve. There was absolutely nothing left to salvage between us. I remained sitting in the quiet kitchen for exactly 10 more minutes, ensuring she was completely occupied on the second floor. I stood up, walked to the front hall closet, and pulled out my heavy winter coat. I reached deep into the back corner of the top shelf and retrieved my locked black leather briefcase. Inside that secure case rested the two items that were about to completely vaporize Declan's entire world. I had the certified legally binding revocation of power of attorney that officially stripped him of all legal authority. And I had the thick manila envelope containing the high-resolution surveillance photographs of his secret young mistress. I gripped the heavy handle of the briefcase, my knuckles turning white with anticipation. The time for hiding in the shadows was officially over. The time for playing the weak, defeated old man had completely expired. I stepped out of the front door, into the freezing morning air, walking briskly toward my car parked down the street. Declan was currently driving downtown to claim his stolen fortune, completely unaware that I was already moving to intercept him at the bank. The final countdown had officially begun. I drove directly from my quiet suburban house to the massive glass and steel headquarters of the primary regional bank, located in the heart of the financial district. The morning air was bitterly cold, whipping fiercely through the city streets, but the heating system inside my car felt completely irrelevant compared to the burning heat radiating through my chest. Ben was already standing on the wide concrete steps waiting for me when I pulled into the visitor parking lot. He was wearing a dark charcoal wool suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase and projecting the intense aura of a man going into absolute legal warfare. We did not exchange a single word of polite greeting. A simple firm nod of the head was all that was necessary between us. We walked through the heavy revolving glass doors together and completely bypassed the long lines of ordinary customers waiting patiently at the teller windows. Ben flashed his official State Bar Association credentials to the armed security guard standing near the elevators and demanded immediate uninterrupted access to the senior branch manager. While we walked quickly down the quiet, thickly carpeted hallway of the executive suite, my mind briefly flashed to my son-in-law. Right at this exact moment, Declan was undoubtedly walking into the plush, luxurious lobby of the downtown title company. I could easily picture him shaking hands with the front desk receptionist, arrogantly taking off his expensive tailored winter coat, and sitting down in a soft leather chair with a cup of complimentary gourmet coffee. He was completely convinced that he was just a few simple signatures away from becoming a very wealthy man. He truly thought the finish line was entirely clear and completely unguarded. He had absolutely no idea that Ben and I were currently stepping into a highly secure banking office clear across town to completely detonate the bridge he was walking on. We entered the large corner office of the senior bank manager, a stern-looking woman named Sarah, who immediately recognized Ben from previous high-profile real estate litigation cases. She asked us to sit down, clearly sensing the intense, unyielding gravity we brought into her room. I sat down in the firm leather guest chair right across from her wide mahogany desk and placed my locked black briefcase securely on my lap. Ben did not bother sitting down. He stood tall, placed both of his hands firmly on the edge of her wooden desk, and commanded the absolute attention of the room. He told Sarah in a cold, uncompromising voice that we were facing an active, massive, and highly sophisticated case of elder financial exploitation and impending federal wire fraud. He demanded that she immediately initiate a complete, unyielding hard freeze on every single financial account, routing number, and credit line associated with my social security number. Sarah blinked rapidly, her highly professional demeanor momentarily cracking under the sheer weight of Ben's aggressive opening statement. She immediately asked for my physical identification to verify my identity. I reached into my heavy coat pocket, pulled out my state-issued driver's license, and placed it firmly on the polished wood in front of her. She quickly typed my full legal name and my social security number into her secure executive terminal. The large monitor instantly populated with my standard checking accounts, my meager retirement funds, and the entirely empty emergency savings account that Declan had already ruthlessly drained 2 days ago. Sarah looked at the screen and then back at me, asking in a very serious tone if I fully understood the severe personal consequences of a total systemic freeze. She warned me that doing this would completely lock my own access to my funds, bouncing any pending checks, and instantly stopping any automatic Thaddeus payments I had previously scheduled. I looked her directly in the eyes, my voice entirely steady and completely devoid of any hesitation. I told her to lock every single door burn, every single bridge, and completely seal the vault tightly shut. I told her I did not care if I could not buy a simple cup of coffee for the next month. I wanted absolute financial paralysis. Sarah swallowed hard, clearly understanding the absolute terror driving my specific request. She typed a rapid sequence of high-level override commands into her keyboard and pressed the final execution button. A bright red digital banner flashed completely across her monitor, confirming that my entire financial identity was now totally locked down under an emergency fraud mandate. With the immediate financial bleeding successfully stopped, it was finally time to deploy the ultimate weapon we had crafted. I clicked open the dual brass locks on my black briefcase. I carefully pulled out the heavy, thick, watermarked pages of the state-certified revocation of power of attorney. I handed the legally binding documents directly to Sarah. I told her clearly that my son-in-law had illegally filed a heavily forged document 2 weeks ago, granting himself total proxy control over my personal estate. I explained that he was currently sitting at a downtown title company, aggressively utilizing that dead-forged authority to sell my residential property to a massive corporate development firm. Sarah took the pages from my hand, her eyes scanning the dense legal text very quickly. When her gaze finally landed on the bright red 12-digit state confirmation number and the official steel notary seal provided by Ben, the remaining color completely drained from her face. She realized the terrifying magnitude of the crime occurring in real time. This was no longer a simple family dispute over a small stolen check. This was a multi-$800,000 commercial real estate theft, happening right under the nose of her banking institution. Ben instructed Sarah to immediately scan the state-certified revocation and transmit it directly to the Regional Federal Fraud Division. He told her to digitally flag the specific escrow account Declan had established to receive the corporate buyout funds. Sarah picked up her desk phone with a visibly trembling hand and dialed the internal emergency number for the Central Fraud Prevention Department. She spoke rapidly into the receiver, reading my exact social security number, the state confirmation code printed on the revocation, and the specific routing details of Declan's hidden escrow account. She officially documented that the original power of attorney was a confirmed malicious forgery, and that the primary account holder was sitting right in front of her, legally blocking all incoming and outgoing financial traffic. The heavy protective machinery of the federal banking system was finally waking up, and its massive unyielding gears were locking firmly into place right around my son-in-law's throat. Sarah hung up the heavy plastic phone receiver and looked back at us, her breathing shallow and fast. She confirmed that the regional fraud director had personally received the digital documents and placed an immediate active trace on the specific escrow routing numbers. The trap was now fully operational and completely armed. The only thing left to do was wait for the arrogant rat to step directly on the trigger plate. Ben finally sat down in the leather chair next to mine, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. We all turned our entire attention to the large computer monitor sitting prominently on Sarah's desk. The screen displayed a live, highly secure feed of the locked escrow account. The balance currently read $0. We were waiting for a massive $800,000 commercial wire transfer to hit that exact digital space from the corporate real estate developers. The silence in the executive office was absolutely deafening. I could hear the second hand ticking loudly on the large analog wall clock above the door. It was exactly 9:15 in the morning. Declan was definitely sitting inside the fancy closing room right now, holding a heavy gold pen aggressively signing his forged name on the final fraudulent property deeds. I clearly pictured his arrogant, victorious smile. I pictured the corporate developers shaking his hand and congratulating him on a smooth transaction. I pictured the exact moment the escrow officer would hit the send button on their own computer terminal, legally authorizing the massive cash payout to secure the property title. The physical tension in my chest was so incredibly tight, I thought my ribs would snap under the immense pressure. I did not take my eyes off the computer screen for a single second. I watched the glowing blue numbers on the monitor, waiting for the devastating financial collision that would finally give me my complete revenge and absolutely destroy the arrogant man who had tried to throw me away. While we sat in the suffocating silence of the bank manager's office, my mind perfectly visualized the exact scene unfolding a few miles away in the luxurious downtown title company. Declan was sitting comfortably in a high-backed leather chair inside a polished glass conference room overlooking the city skyline. The corporate real estate developers were sitting directly across from him, sipping expensive bottled water, and casually discussing their destructive demolition plans for my beautiful family home. An escrow officer, entirely unaware that she was actively facilitating a massive federal crime, pushed a thick stack of legally binding closing documents across the smooth mahogany table. She smiled politely and handed Declan a heavy gold pen. He did not hesitate for a single second. He did not feel a sudden agonizing pang of guilt about destroying my life, throwing me into a substandard medical facility, or completely abandoning his own loyal wife and innocent child. He aggressively gripped the heavy pen and confidently signed his highly practiced forged signature on the bottom line of the final property deed. He handed the thick stack of documents back to the escrow officer with a wide, intensely arrogant smile, completely believing he had just successfully pulled off the greatest financial heist of his entire life. The silver-haired corporate developers stood up and shook his hand for the final time, officially and legally cementing the fraudulent commercial sale. The escrow officer turned back to her sophisticated computer terminal to initiate the massive financial payout. She carefully typed in the specific routing numbers for Declan's hidden escrow account, officially authorized the transfer of $800,000 in liquid cash, and pressed the final execution key. The digital money instantly left the massive corporate development account and shot through the complex, invisible web of the national banking system. heading directly toward the massive reinforced brick wall I had just meticulously built. Back inside the secure executive bank office, my eyes remained completely glued to the large glowing computer monitor sitting prominently on Sarah's desk. The digital clock on the bottom corner of her screen clicked silently to exactly 9:30 in the morning. Suddenly, the tense quiet room was pierced by a sharp, high-pitched electronic chime that made my heart race. The live secure feed of Declan's previously empty escrow account violently refreshed. A massive block of bright green text appeared rapidly on the screen, indicating an incoming commercial wire transfer of exactly $800,000. But the massive sum of money did not successfully deposit into the account. The exact microsecond the massive funds attempted to clear the final automated security checkpoint, they violently collided with the absolute, uncompromising hard freeze Ben and I had initiated just 30 minutes prior. The complex banking system reacted with terrifying immediate mechanical hostility. The bright green text on the monitor instantly turned into a flashing aggressive red color. A large digital warning box completely covered the center of the screen, displaying the words "Transaction Denied" and "Account Permanently Suspended" in bold capital letters. The massive $800,000 wire transfer was instantly intercepted, frozen in a secure digital purgatory, and completely confiscated by the Central Fraud Division. Declan's entire master plan did not just quietly fail. It completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces against the impenetrable legal shield of the state-certified revocation document. I let out a long, incredibly heavy breath that I felt like I had been holding for the past 4 agonizing days. The deep, crushing physical weight on my chest completely evaporated entirely, replaced by a surging, powerful wave of absolute, undeniable victory. I looked over at Ben. My oldest, most loyal friend leaned back slowly in his leather guest chair, took off his reading glasses, and allowed a cold, deeply satisfied smile to finally spread across his face. Sarah sat perfectly still behind her large mahogany desk, staring intently at the flashing red warnings on her computer monitor. She reached out with a slightly trembling hand and typed a quick sequence of administrative commands to verify the exact legal status of the intercepted funds. She looked up at us, her eyes wide with a complex mixture of professional shock and deep respect for the flawless trap we had engineered. She confirmed in a quiet, incredibly serious voice that the massive wire transfer had officially crossed state banking lines before it was violently blocked by the internal freeze. Because the fraudulent transaction involved multiple major banking institutions, a stolen identity, a forged power of attorney, and an amount vastly exceeding the minimum federal threshold. The internal security system had automatically and instantly notified the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She explained that regional federal fraud agents and local police detectives were already receiving the automated emergency alert packets detailing the exact location of the fraudulent signing and the specific identity of the account holder. Declan was no longer just a simple domestic abuser, bullying an old man in a dark hallway. He was now officially categorized as a highly dangerous perpetrator of massive federal wire fraud. He had successfully completed the physical crime by signing the papers. He had left an undeniable digital paper trail, and there was absolutely no legal way for him to cancel the transaction or claim it was a simple family misunderstanding. He was permanently locked into the devastating consequences of his own unchecked greed. The heavy machinery of the justice system was actively preparing to hunt him down, and he was currently walking out of the title company, completely oblivious to the massive storm about to completely destroy his life. I vividly pictured Declan stepping confidently out of the towering glass doors of the title company building and walking out into the freezing winter air. He was probably pulling his thick, expensive wool coat tightly around his shoulders, inhaling the crisp city air, and feeling like the absolute undisputed master of his own grand destiny. He probably reached into his coat pocket to retrieve his car keys, eager to drive directly to the luxury downtown condominium to celebrate his massive victory with his young blonde mistress. But before he could even reach his car, the sharp vibrating ring of his expensive smartphone would entirely shatter his peaceful delusion. He would pull the phone from his pocket, casually expecting a congratulatory text message from the developers or a loving note from his secret girlfriend. Instead, he would see the frantic, terrified name of his luxury real estate agent flashing brightly on the digital screen. He would swipe to answer the call, his arrogant smile still firmly plastered on his face. But the voice on the other end of the line would not be offering warm holiday congratulations. The luxury real estate agent would be screaming in absolute unfiltered panic. She would rapidly inform him that the initial $80,000 earnest money check he had aggressively used to secure the $1 million penthouse had just violently bounced back from the bank, completely flagged for severe internal fraud. She would yell directly into the phone that the luxury condominium management company was entirely furious. The property was immediately going back on the public market. And most terrifying of all, two uniformed police officers were currently standing in the pristine marble lobby of the building, aggressively asking for his exact whereabouts. The absolute horrifying realization would suddenly crash down upon his shoulders right there in the freezing cold street. He did not have his stolen $800,000. He did not have his stolen $80,000 deposit. He did not have his $1 million penthouse. He had absolutely nothing. The blood would completely drain from his face as he realized his flawless master plan was actually a perfectly engineered financial guillotine, and the heavy steel blade had just violently dropped. He was suddenly a highly wanted fugitive, completely trapped in a nightmare of his own making, and the only place left for him to run in absolute desperation was back to the very house he had just tried to destroy. I left the secure executive office of the regional bank and drove back to my quiet suburban neighborhood. The freezing winter wind continued to howl against the windshield of my car, but the thick, suffocating weight that had rested heavily on my shoulders for the past 4 days was entirely gone. I felt incredibly light, highly focused, and completely ready for the final devastating act of this tragedy. I parked my car inside the garage, intentionally pulling it very close to the massive wall of brown cardboard moving boxes Declan had proudly packed with my belongings. I looked at those sealed boxes and felt a deep, profound sense of vindication. Those boxes were not going to a cheap medical transport van or a low-income nursing facility. They were going to stay right here in my beautiful home, exactly where they belonged. I unlocked the interior garage door and stepped into the warm, familiar hallway of my house. The property was completely silent. My daughter Serena had taken my grandson Mason to a holiday winter festival downtown, completely oblivious to the massive financial explosion that had just occurred across the city. Her absence was a temporary blessing. I needed the house to be entirely clear for the violent storm that was rapidly approaching our front door. I walked directly into the center of my spacious living room. I slowly took off my heavy winter coat and draped it neatly over the back of the sofa. I walked over to my favorite dark brown leather armchair, the specific chair I had sat in every single evening for the past 2 decades. Declan had recently joked that the chair was too old and ugly for his new modern aesthetic, openly planning to throw it into the local city dump the moment the corporate house sale was finalized. I sat down heavily in the comfortable leather seat, resting my hands firmly on the wide armrests. I assumed the physical posture of a man who was entirely in control of his own domain. I did not have to wait very long for my reinforcements to arrive. Exactly 15 minutes after I returned home, a dark, unmarked sedan pulled quietly into my driveway. I watched through the large front window as Ben stepped out of the vehicle, followed closely by 2 men wearing dark, heavy winter suits and thick overcoats. I stood up and opened the front door to let them inside the house. Ben walked in first, giving me a firm, highly reassuring nod. He turned and introduced the 2 men standing behind him. They were senior investigators from the Regional Financial Crimes Divisions, Detective Reynolds and Detective Carter. They did not smile. They did not offer warm holiday pleasantries. They moved with the cold, highly efficient precision of veteran law enforcement officers who were actively hunting a dangerous federal criminal. Detective Reynolds was a tall, incredibly imposing man with sharp gray eyes that seemed to instantly scan and evaluate every single detail of my living room. Detective Carter was slightly shorter, but possessed a thick, muscular build that clearly communicated his deep physical authority. Ben briefly explained the immediate layout of the house to the detectives. He pointed toward the front foyer and the main hallway, outlining exactly how we would position ourselves to successfully trap Declan the moment he inevitably returned to the property. Detective Reynolds instructed me to sit right back down in my leather armchair. He told me to remain completely silent and entirely still when my son-in-law burst through the front door. He wanted Declan to fully incriminate himself, to show his absolute true colors, and to aggressively demonstrate the exact elder abuse he had been secretly inflicting upon me behind closed doors. Ben stood directly to my right side, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face set in a look of absolute unyielding legal judgment. The two federal detectives positioned themselves perfectly in the deep shadows near the wide archway of the living room, completely out of direct sight from the main front hallway, but perfectly positioned to instantly block any attempt at a physical escape. We formed a silent, impenetrable wall of absolute justice, and we waited in the quiet house for the desperate criminal to arrive. The suffocating silence of the living room was suddenly broken by the loud, aggressive sound of a car engine roaring down the quiet suburban street. Through the large front window, I watched Declan's vehicle violently jump the curb and skid dangerously across the snow-covered driveway. He slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into park before it had even completely stopped moving. The heavy driver's side door flew open and Declan practically fell out of the vehicle. He did not look like the arrogant, highly confident millionaire who had walked out of my kitchen just a few short hours ago. His expensive tailored winter coat was completely unbuttoned and flapping wildly in the freezing wind. His silver silk tie was violently loosened around his neck. His face was entirely flushed with a dark, terrifying shade of panicked red. He was moving with the frantic, highly reckless energy of a cornered animal, desperately searching for a way to survive. He aggressively stomped up the concrete front steps, completely ignoring the icy patches on the ground. He did not bother reaching into his pocket for his house keys. He simply raised his heavy leather boot and violently kicked the solid oak front door right near the heavy metal handle. The door shuddered under the immense physical impact, but remained securely locked. He kicked it a second time, simultaneously twisting the doorknob with aggressive, panicked force. The heavy deadbolt finally gave way, and the thick oak door crashed loudly against the interior hallway wall. Declan stormed into the front foyer like a completely unhinged madman. He immediately began screaming my name at the absolute top of his lungs. His voice was completely raw, echoing with a mixture of intense, uncontrolled rage and absolute, undeniable terror. He demanded to know exactly where I was hiding. He screamed that I had done something incredibly stupid to the bank accounts and that I needed to fix the massive error right this very second. He stomped heavily down the hardwood hallway, violently throwing his expensive briefcase against the wall, clearly intending to completely intimidate and physically threaten the weak. Helpless old man, he firmly believed he had completely conquered. He was entirely operating under the pathetic delusion that his cruel dominant tactics from the past 4 days would instantly force me into complete submission. He reached the wide archway of the living room. His hands balled tightly into aggressive fists, his chest heaving heavily with panicked exertion. He took one massive step into the room, his dark eyes frantically searching the space for his victim. The exact moment Declan crossed the threshold into the living room, his aggressive, violent momentum hit a massive, invisible brick wall. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heavy breathing completely caught in his throat. He stared directly at me, sitting calmly and quietly in my dark leather armchair. He fully expected to find me cowering in fear, frantically packing my pathetic brown suitcase, or crying quietly in the corner of the room. Instead, he found me sitting perfectly upright, my hands resting comfortably on the armrests, looking at him with an expression of absolute, terrifying, emotional detachment. But the sheer shock of my calm demeanor was absolutely nothing compared to the horrifying realization of who was standing directly beside me. Declan's eyes slowly darted to his left, landing entirely on Ben. He recognized the ruthless real estate attorney immediately. He saw the cold, highly calculating smile resting on Ben's face, and he instantly realized that the senior lawyer was not here to negotiate a peaceful family settlement. The thick, arrogant delusion Declan had been breathing for the past 2 weeks began to completely evaporate from his lungs. Declan took a slow, highly uncertain step backward, instinctively trying to retreat toward the open front door. But before his expensive leather shoe could even touch the hallway floor, Detective Reynolds and Detective Carter stepped smoothly and purposefully out of the deep shadows of the archway. They moved with absolute terrifying synchronicity, instantly cutting off his only physical avenue of escape. Declan rapidly snapped his head toward the two imposing strangers, his eyes immediately locked onto the heavy gold federal badges clipped prominently to the belts of their dark trousers. The absolute unadulterated reality of the massive trap he had walked into completely crushed him in a single devastating second. The aggressive, angry flush entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale shade of absolute white. His broad shoulders completely slumped forward, and his hands began to tremble violently at his sides. The incredibly arrogant millionaire executive, who was eagerly planning to steal my family home and run away with his young blonde mistress, completely vanished instantly, replaced by a terrified, pathetic amateur criminal who suddenly realized that he was about to lose absolutely everything. Declan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically in his throat. He desperately tried to forcefully pivot his behavior, attempting to construct a brand new lie to save himself from the inescapable disaster. He forced a weak, incredibly shaky smile onto his pale face. He looked directly at the two federal detectives and stammered wildly, raising his trembling hands in a pathetic gesture of completely fake surrender. He forced out a laugh that sounded like dry, broken glass. He nervously told the detectives that there must be a massive, terrible misunderstanding at the downtown bank today. He claimed that he was just trying to finalize a simple, completely legal real estate transaction to help his aging, confused father-in-law manage his complicated retirement assets. He looked directly at me, his dark eyes silently begging me to play along with his desperate, pathetic charade. He called me Dad, heavily emphasizing the fake family connection, and asked me to please tell the nice officers that everything was completely fine and that we were just handling a private family matter. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his lie was genuinely incredible to witness. He was actively attempting to manipulate the situation, fully believing his smooth corporate charm could easily confuse two veteran federal investigators. Detective Reynolds did not smile. He did not laugh at the pathetic attempt at manipulation. He simply took a slow, highly deliberate step directly toward my son-in-law, his gray eyes completely devoid of any warmth or patience. Detective Reynolds looked Declan right in the eyes and stated in a deep, commanding voice that they were not there to discuss a simple banking error. He informed Declan that they were actively investigating a highly coordinated, massive instance of federal wire fraud, aggravated elder exploitation, and the intentional use of heavily forged legal documents across state lines. The detective's words hit Declan like repeated physical blows to the chest. He physically staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He realized in that exact terrifying moment that the police already knew everything. They knew about the fake power of attorney. They knew about the stolen $80,000 deposit. They knew about the $800,000 commercial wire transfer. The trap was absolutely flawless. The steel jaws had violently snapped shut, and I sat entirely silent in my armchair, peacefully watching the arrogant monster completely suffocate under the crushing weight of his own absolute destruction. Detective Reynolds did not waste a single breath on polite introductions or calm negotiations. He stepped directly into the center of my living room, completely invading Declan's personal space with his massive frame. The veteran investigator began to meticulously list the incredible sequence of devastating federal crimes my son-in-law had aggressively committed over the past 2 weeks. His voice was loud, highly authoritative, and entirely uncompromising. He stated clearly that the Financial Crimes Division possessed undeniable, irrefutable digital evidence of Declan executing a heavily forged general durable power of attorney to steal a private residential property. Stealing a private residential property constituted severe criminal forgery and highly aggravated elder financial exploitation. Declan physically shrank back with every single word, his brand new expensive tailored suit suddenly looking completely ridiculous and entirely out of place on his violently trembling frame. Detective Carter then stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with his partner, and delivered the absolute final crushing legal blow. He looked Declan up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated professional disgust. Carter formally announced that because Declan had actively used a federally insured banking institution to electronically transfer $800,000 in stolen cash across state lines, the underlying crime was now officially classified as massive federal wire fraud. He made absolutely sure to heavily emphasize the terrifying reality that federal financial crimes carry extremely strict, mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. He looked Declan right in the terrified eyes and promised him that he was currently looking at a mandatory minimum of 10 to 15 years entirely locked inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. Declan began to shake so violently that I could actually hear his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the hardwood floor. He gasped loudly for air, his chest heaving rapidly as a full-blown, completely uncontrolled panic attack entirely consumed his physical body. He desperately looked back and forth between Ben, the two massive federal detectives, and me, his eyes wide and silently begging for a miraculous lifeline that absolutely did not exist. Right at that exact highly terrifying moment, the heavy wooden back door of the kitchen violently swung open. My daughter Serena walked into the house completely oblivious to the massive life-altering storm currently raging inside the living room. I had explicitly asked my neighbor to briefly watch my young grandson Mason at the local winter festival, so Serena could quickly run home to grab his forgotten heavy winter gloves. She walked down the hardwood hallway humming a very cheerful holiday song, holding her car keys casually in her right hand. She stepped through the wide living room archway and froze completely solid in her tracks. She saw the two towering, unfamiliar men wearing heavy dark winter coats and displaying gold federal badges on their belts. She saw her husband pale, violently trembling, and entirely backed into a tight corner like a terrified trapped rat. She looked at me, sitting entirely calm and completely silent in my dark leather armchair, and pure unfiltered confusion immediately washed over her tired face. She took a slow, highly uncertain step toward Declan, instinctively wanting to comfort the man she genuinely believed loved and protected her. But the exact second Declan saw his wife enter the room, his fundamental, deep-rooted core cowardice completely took over his entire personality. He did not try to protect her from the horrific situation. He did not try to shield her from the massive legal and emotional fallout about to destroy their lives. He instantly raised his shaking right hand, pointed his index finger directly at Serena, and aggressively threw her right to the hungry federal wolves. He screamed at the absolute top of his lungs that the entire fraudulent real estate scheme was completely her idea from the very beginning. He hysterically lied directly to the federal detectives, claiming that Serena deeply hated me, that she desperately wanted to forcibly sell the family house to fund her own lifestyle, and that she was the absolute mastermind who had personally forced him to forge the legal documents. He shouted wildly that she had constantly begged him to steal my retirement money so they could save their failing marriage, and that he was simply following her strict demands. Serena dropped her car keys in absolute shock. They hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, ringing clatter that echoed loudly in the tense room. Her mouth fell wide open in absolute horrified disbelief as she stood perfectly still, listening to her beloved husband actively attempt to send her to a federal prison simply to save his own pathetic skin. I knew it was finally time to completely end this miserable, disgusting charade. I slowly stood up from my comfortable leather armchair. I reached down and picked up the locked black leather briefcase resting quietly near my feet. I carried it across the room and placed it securely on the glass coffee table, sitting directly in the center of the living room space. The sharp metallic clicking sound of the heavy brass latches popping open echoed loudly in the quiet room, instantly drawing everyone's absolute attention. I opened the heavy leather lid and reached inside. I completely bypassed the stack of certified legal documents and pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope containing the high-resolution, private surveillance photographs. I walked slowly and highly purposefully around the edge of the coffee table until I was standing directly in front of my deeply shocked and entirely paralyzed daughter. Declan watched my hands incredibly closely, his dark eyes suddenly widening with a brand new, terrifying realization that I was holding something infinitely more destructive than simple banking records or forged property deeds. I did not say a single word to him. I simply pulled the thick stack of glossy photographs out of the envelope and threw them aggressively onto the glass surface of the coffee table right in front of Serena. The colorful, highly detailed images scattered wildly across the smooth glass. The very first photograph clearly showed Declan wrapping his arm tightly and intimately around the waist of his young blonde mistress inside the polished white marble lobby of the luxury downtown condominium building. The second photograph showed them drinking expensive imported champagne and laughing affectionately together at a highly exclusive romantic restaurant. The third photograph showed him aggressively signing a digital delivery clipboard for tens of thousands of dollars worth of custom Italian bedroom furniture. I looked directly into my daughter's entirely shattered eyes and delivered the final absolute truth that would completely cleanse my home. I told her in a cold, unyielding, and completely steady voice that Declan was never planning to buy a new beautiful house for their struggling family. I told her that he had specifically registered exactly 2 secure electronic elevator keys for the $1 million penthouse property, one exclusively for himself and one exclusively for the 24-year-old woman who is currently decorating their new master bedroom. I made absolutely sure she fully understood the sheer breathtaking magnitude of his evil. I explained clearly that her husband was actively planning to let the ruthless corporate developers completely bulldoze our precious family home into the dirt, entirely steal the $800,000 in liquid cash, and permanently abandon her and her innocent young son on the freezing winter streets without a single penny to their names. Serena stared down at the glossy surveillance photographs, completely covering the glass coffee table. She did not cry immediately. Her entire physical body simply locked into a rigid state of absolute profound psychological shock. She slowly reached out with a violently trembling hand and picked up the vivid picture of Declan intimately kissing the young blonde woman. Her eyes rapidly scanned the undeniable high-definition visual evidence of her completely shattered reality, the perfect suburban marriage she had desperately fought to protect for years, the handsome husband she had blindly defended against me just a few hours ago. The entire hopeful foundation of her adult life was absolutely nothing more than a disgusting, highly elaborate trap, meticulously designed to completely destroy her. A low, agonizing, and entirely hollow wail suddenly erupted from deep inside her chest. It was a terrifying, deeply guttural sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak and total, absolute betrayal. She dropped the glossy photograph back onto the table, covered her pale face with both of her shaking hands, and collapsed heavily onto her knees right there in the center of the living room carpet. She sobbed violently, her entire body shaking with the immense, crushing force of the devastating revelation. Declan completely panicked, realizing his ultimate social and financial destruction was fully complete. He took a reckless, highly desperate step forward, reaching his hands out toward his sobbing wife, hysterically shouting her name, desperately trying to formulate a pathetic, entirely unbelievable excuse for the undeniable photographs. But he never even got the chance to speak another pathetic lie. Detective Reynolds and Detective Carter moved with absolute terrifying physical speed. They lunged forward, simultaneously grabbed Declan violently by his broad shoulders, and aggressively slammed him face first against the hard plaster wall of my living room hallway. The heavy, violent physical impact rattled the antique picture frames hanging nearby. Detective Carter grabbed Declan's wrists with immense force, twisted them painfully behind his back, and secured them tightly with a pair of heavy, freezing steel police handcuffs. The loud, sharp clicking sound of the metal ratchets firmly locking into place was the absolute most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Detective Reynolds leaned closely into Declan's ear and loudly professionally read him his absolute Miranda rights, explicitly informing him that he had the right to remain completely silent. The 2 massive federal detectives forcefully pulled Declan away from the wall and dragged him aggressively toward the open front door. Declan kicked his legs wildly, screaming in absolute panic, begging me to immediately call the bank manager, begging Serena to please look at him one last time, completely melting down into a pathetic weeping puddle of absolute terror. They hauled him forcefully out the front door, marched him roughly down the snowy concrete front steps, and shoved him violently into the back seat of their dark, unmarked police sedan. I stood quietly in my living room, looking out the front window, and watched the official vehicle drive away down the freezing street, taking the absolute worst mistake of my family's entire life entirely out of our world forever. The heavy oak front door remained wide open for several long minutes after the unmarked police vehicle disappeared entirely down the snow-covered street. I stood there silently, feeling the freezing winter wind blow aggressively through the hallway, letting the crisp air physically cleanse the toxic, heavy atmosphere that had suffocated my home for years. Ben stood quietly beside me, placed a strong, reassuring hand on my right shoulder, and told me he would personally handle all the necessary legal follow-up with the federal prosecutors. He gathered his heavy leather briefcase, gave me one final nod of deep, profound respect, and walked out to his car, leaving me completely alone with my daughter. I slowly pushed the front door closed, locked the heavy brass deadbolt with a satisfying click, and turned around to face the living room. Serena was still sitting on the hardwood floor exactly where she had collapsed. The glossy surveillance photographs of her husband and his young blonde mistress were still scattered wildly across the glass coffee table, serving as a permanent, undeniable testament to her completely shattered reality. She slowly raised her head and looked directly at me. Her face was entirely streaked with dark ruined makeup, and her eyes were completely red from crying. She looked exactly like a frightened, lost little girl, desperately searching for the warm, protective father she had completely taken for granted her entire adult life. She pushed herself up from the floor, her hands trembling violently, and took a slow, highly unsteady step toward me. She began to speak, her voice cracking with heavy, breathless sobs. She apologized profusely, repeating the empty words over and over again like a broken record. She swore to me that she never truly understood the massive, terrifying extent of Declan's evil plan. She begged me to forgive her for being so incredibly blind, for completely ignoring my feelings, and for allowing her husband to treat me so poorly in my own home. She reached out her shaking hands, desperately wanting me to step forward and pull her into a tight, comforting embrace. She cried heavily and told me that she had absolutely nowhere else to go. She pleaded with me to let her and my young grandson Mason stay in the house, promising that things would be completely different now that the monster was finally gone. She painted a pathetic, desperate picture of a fresh start, heavily hoping I would simply slip back into my old, comfortable role as her unconditional financial and emotional safety net. I looked at my daughter standing there in the hallway, begging for my protection, and I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, warm well of unconditional fatherly love that I had freely given her for 34 years was completely dry. I did not step forward to hug her. I did not offer her a warm tissue to dry her tears. I kept my physical distance, crossing my arms firmly over my chest, and looked at her with the exact same cold, analytical detachment I would use to inspect an irreparably damaged piece of machinery. I spoke to her in a quiet, steady, and entirely uncompromising voice. I told her that I did not believe her apologies for a single second. I reminded her of the brutal, undeniable reality that she had stood right next to me in my warm kitchen just yesterday morning and actively begged me to surrender my entire life savings and my personal dignity simply to save her. Toxic marriage. I made it absolutely clear that her tears right now were not tears of genuine remorse for the horrific pain she had intentionally caused me. They were simply tears of profound panic because her perfect suburban illusion had violently collapsed, and her endless source of free money had completely vanished. She had actively chosen to stand by a cruel, arrogant predator while he plotted to throw me onto the freezing winter streets. And she only changed her tune when she discovered she was also on the final menu. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her that she was no longer welcome to live under my roof. The absolute shock on her face was almost instantaneous. She gasped loudly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. She truly thought my anger was entirely directed at Declan, and that she would easily escape the massive consequences of her own terrible complicity. I shattered that final delusion completely. I told her that she had exactly 30 days to pack every single piece of her clothing, gather all of her personal belongings, and permanently vacate my property. I explicitly stated that if she was not completely moved out by the end of January, I would have Ben file formal legal eviction papers and have the local county sheriff physically remove her from the premises. Serena fell back against the wall, sliding down, until she was sitting on the hardwood floor, again weeping loudly into her hands. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. She was a grown woman who had made a conscious, terrible choice to betray her own father, and it was entirely time for her to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world without my constant enabling protection. I realized in that moment that true family is not defined by shared blood. It is defined by mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and a love that never turns into abuse. While she continued to cry on the hallway floor, I addressed the only remaining piece of this tragic situation that actually mattered to my heart. I spoke loudly over her heavy sobs, forcing her to listen to the final terms of our brand new reality. I told her that I had already made permanent ironclad financial arrangements for my young grandson. I explained that the $80,000 in life insurance money from my late wife, the exact money Declan had arrogantly tried to steal for his luxury downtown penthouse deposit, was now entirely safe and heavily protected. Ben had meticulously drafted a highly secure, impenetrable legal trust fund exclusively in Mason's name. I made it absolutely and painfully clear to Serena that she would never have legal access to a single penny of that money. She could never borrow against it. She could never manage it, and she could absolutely never use it to pay off the massive mountain of credit card debt her criminal husband had left behind. The trust was entirely locked down by an independent corporate executive and could only be accessed by Mason himself when he officially turned 25 years old to pay for his college education or to purchase his first home. I told Serena that I loved my grandson deeply, and I would always ensure his future was completely secure, but I would absolutely not allow her to use him as a convenient pawn to extract any more resources from my life. I finished my statement, turned my back on her weeping form, and walked slowly up the carpeted stairs to my master bedroom. I closed the heavy wooden door firmly behind me, finally shutting out the exhausting, pathetic sounds of her emotional breakdown. The massive war was officially over, and I had successfully defended everything that truly belonged to me. Fast forward exactly 30 days later. It was a bright, incredibly crisp morning in early February. The sun was shining beautifully through the large living room windows, reflecting brightly off the clean hardwood floors. The massive stacks of brown cardboard moving boxes that Declan had so arrogantly packed in the garage were completely gone. Serena had quietly hired a cheap moving truck and left the house 2 days before the final legal deadline. She had taken her son, her clothes, and her entirely shattered pride to a small, cramped apartment on the other side of the city. Declan was currently sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell, completely denied bail, awaiting his formal sentencing hearing, where he would undoubtedly receive his mandatory decade behind heavy iron bars. The heavy, toxic, and deeply parasitic presence that had heavily infected my home for 4 long years was finally completely eradicated. The air inside the house felt incredibly light, fresh, and remarkably clean. I walked slowly into my formal dining room. The grand mahogany table was no longer surrounded by greedy, entitled intruders disrespecting my property. It was perfectly polished, completely empty, and entirely mine. I pulled out the large wooden chair at the head of the table, my rightful and undisputed place, and sat down comfortably. I rested my hands firmly on the smooth wood and looked around the beautiful room I had built with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. I picked up a warm ceramic mug filled with fresh, steaming black coffee. I took a slow, deep sip, letting the rich, bitter taste entirely ground me in the present moment. I did not feel lonely. I felt an incredible sense of deep, enduring peace. There was absolutely no yelling, no disrespect, and no fear lingering in the hallways. There was only a profound, beautiful, and absolute quiet. The long, terrifying nightmare was entirely over. I had faced the absolute worst kind of betrayal, and I had survived by using my intellect, my patience, and my uncompromising resolve. The house was finally mine again, and the rest of my life was entirely my own to enjoy. Looking back on this painful family story, I finally understand something I was too proud to admit before. Blood alone does not define loyalty. Love alone does not guarantee respect. What happened to me was not just a simple mistake. It was a devastating family betrayal that forced me to see the truth about my own life. For years, I believed silence was strength. I believed enduring humiliation would somehow protect my family story from breaking apart. But that belief nearly destroyed me. This family story taught me that kindness without boundaries invites exploitation. And when family betrayal grows in the shadows, it can quietly consume everything you built. And to you listening to this story, remember this: never surrender your dignity just to preserve the illusion of peace. If someone turns your love into a weapon against you, step back and see the truth clearly. I ignored the warning signs for too long in my own family story, and that mistake nearly cost me everything. In my darkest moment, I asked myself why this family betrayal happened at all. The only answer that gave me peace was faith. I believe God allowed me to see the truth before it was too late. I believe God gives us strength not to avoid betrayal, but to survive it. And sometimes, when justice seems impossible, God quietly guides events so the truth can finally surface. Many people will call what happened family revenge, and perhaps they are right. But my family revenge was never about hatred. It was about protecting what my wife left behind. It was about refusing to let greed rewrite our family story. And if I'm honest, every act of family revenge comes with a price, because even when justice wins, the wounds of family betrayal remain. If you take anything from this family story, let it be this: ask questions early, protect your independence, and never mistake manipulation for love. Before you go, share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you listening from? And what would you have done in my place? Your voice keeps this community alive. If this family story resonated with you, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. And a small note before the next stories begin: some future episodes may contain dramatized elements created for reflection and educational purposes. If that isn't the kind of content you enjoy, feel free to choose something else that suits you better.